Good morning, everyone. My name's Roberta Golick, and I would like to welcome you all to the 2018 Fireside Chat.
And we have a fireplace.
We actually have one going. It's my great honor today to be the interviewer of our esteemed colleague, Jim Oldham. But before we get going, I wanted to share with you how Jim and I met. So the year was 1985, and it was at an Academy meeting, and I found myself at an Academy dinner with a bunch of newish arbitrators, newish Academy members, and we were at a big round table at dinner, and Jim was sitting exactly across from me, about 6 feet away. And we were enjoying our dinner, and I couldn't imagine how I had ever met him before, but there was something about him that was so familiar to me, and I couldn't place it. So
entrancing.
So what?
So entrancing.
Yeah, right. You took the words right out of my mouth. Yes. So I spent the dinner kind of staring at him, and
I noticed.
And finally, over the tiramisu dessert, I had a Proustian moment of remembrance. And so I said to Jim, do you by any chance have a brother?
And I said, I have 2 brothers.
So I said, well, is one of them a doctor?
I said, they're both doctors.
I said, is one of them a psychiatrist?
I said, yes.
And then what did you say?
He is an identical twin.
And so it was that more than 15 years earlier, when I was a college student, I had a summer job as a typist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. And that year, in the crop of psychiatric interns, there was one extremely handsome Dr. Oldham. And I will confess that I had a very powerful, although unrequited, crush on Dr. Oldham. And so here it was many years later, and in true psychiatric fashion, I transferred my college crush straight onto Arbitrator Oldham, and we have been very close friends ever since. So today, let's get going. And my first question is, how is your brother?
He is still married.
But I understand he later became the director of the New York State Psychiatric
He did.
Institute.
He was director of the Psychiatric Institute at Columbia University in New York for about 25 years.
Great. Well, moving on to the real fireside chat, my second question is, does the phrase "an okie from Muskogee" mean anything to you?
Now, you notice that's hard to do a segue to that. But yes, it does. And you know the song, An Okie from Muskogee by Merle Haggard. Was everybody's favorite for a time. And the lyrics, I just want to share you the first 4 lines of that song. He sang, "We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee. We don't take no trips on LSD. We don't burn our draft cards down the main street. We like living right and being free." Well, the reason this is our opening remark is I am an Okie from Muskogee. That's where I was born. And we can get to the story of how we ended up in Muskogee later, but that's where my father grew up and became a doctor.
Well,
No, my grandfather.
let's examine the family tree a bit and tell us about your grandfather.
My father's father was a doctor, but he lived and did his medical training and practiced medicine for some years in Madison County in Kentucky. And then, for reasons I've never figured out, he and his wife went westward, and they traveled, how I don't know, but they ended up in Indian Territory, Oklahoma. And that's where they stopped, in Muskogee.
That was before Oklahoma was a state, is that right?
Yes, it was. And I'm not sure what the draw was. It may be, some of you may know this, that the football team for the University of Oklahoma is called the Sooners. And why? Because there was free land, and it was allocated on first-come, first-served basis. So the ones who got there sooner got the land. Possibly that was what happened with my grandfather. But he established a medical practice then in Muskogee, and he and his wife, Mary Newland, had 6 children, and the last of that group, the 6th, was my father, named Newland Oldham, after his mother-in-law, her father's mother. So that side of the family then established the presence in Muskogee. Indeed, the place that everybody lived became a sort of a marker in town. There's a plaque on the front of it called the Oldham Family Home, and one of my cousins still lives there.
And well, let's switch to your mother's side of the family. Your mother's father, I understand, was a farmer, and his wife was quite the entrepreneur. So tell us those stories.
Well, I'll come to what Bobby just mentioned in a second, but my mother's mother, again, the family lore is that she traveled west in a Conestoga wagon as a small child, and also to Indian Territory. And by the way, my father, I'll come back to my mother in a second, but my father was born, when he was born, his birth certificate is also Indian Territory, Oklahoma. And you'll see the Indian names of the town. Muskogee was an Indian name. My mother's family grew up in Shawnee, and that's an Indian tribe. But once my grandmother and my grandfather, who became the small-time farmer, near a little town close to Shawnee, also an Indian name called Tecumseh. He was a famous Indian chief. So they set up small-time farming, and my mother was born, and she had these interesting memories in her childhood, one of which Bobby was referring to. She said that she would ride with her mother on a buckboard wagon as her mother went around the region selling goods to Indian squaws. And the principal product that they sold was a girdle. I was told it was a true story.
So they lived on a farm, and you told me that you remembered this farm from your childhood. Is that right?
Oh, yes, my John, my twin brother, and Newland, all of us spent weeks during the summertime on this small farm. My grandfather, the farmer, was only trying to raise enough money to sustain his family, And he did raise some crops, wheat in particular. He had a dairy farm for a while. I remember helping him milk the cows for a time. He raised hogs and then would butcher them and go and put the meat into the smokehouse. One vivid memory, which you will appreciate why I use the word vivid, we would come home from church on a Sunday morning, and then my grandmother would change clothes, and she would go down to the hen house, and she would bring out a chicken, and she would bring the chicken into an open space, and instead of using an axe, what she would do is to take the chicken by the neck and to whirl it around in the air hard until the neck severed, and the chicken would then flap around, spouting blood until death.
It's a good thing you have a psychiatrist in the family.
Well, but imagine the next step. We then had to go to lunch after this chicken had been plucked and cleaned and cooked, and that was difficult.
So tell us just briefly about your father and your mother, how they met and got married.
Sure. Again, they were both Oklahomans. They met as students in college. They both went to Oklahoma Baptist University, OBU, as it was called. And romance emerged rather quickly between them. My father, who was a very pragmatic man, thought about the situation, and he said, if I stay here and with this wonderful woman, I'm not ever going to do any serious work. So he said, I better transfer to another school. So he transferred to the University of Arkansas, where he finished his degree in civil engineering. Subsequent to that, he came back to Oklahoma, and he and my mother got married, and then lived a very, very happy married life. I think I would mention one thing that occurred during the Depression years. It's hard to know what to do, but my father was a civil engineer, so he was called upon to do some road building, and he was a surveyor then on the road crews at the time. This was a good, sensible work at the time, but it had a very unfortunate after effect, because one of the principal ingredients in road building at the time was asbestos. And so that implanted in his body and ultimately caused his death at age 58, much later. So my mother was then a widow, but she was a resourceful woman and made her own life after that, sort of combining activities in the Baptist church, where she was quite active, and then developing friends on worldwide travel trips. And she also was an amateur poet throughout most of her life, and she continued that practice.
So tell us, what was it like growing up as an identical twin?
One more thing about my mother. My mother was very surprising. We moved to Carlsbad, New Mexico, and I failed to mention that John and I never really lived in Muskogee. We only went there to be born, because grandfather and uncle were doctors in Muskogee. So then we returned to where the family was living at the time, which was Carlsbad, New Mexico, where the Carlsbad Caverns are. Some of you may have been there. And my mother, her mother, Waltzy, the chicken lady, was also educated in a time when it was a large focus on English language and English literature. And my grandmother, it was a time when one of the principal learning methods was to memorize things. So my grandmother would memorize many poems, famous poems, and I can remember even to her dying day calling upon her to recite some of these poems, which she would do flawlessly all through her life. Well, that seed was planted in Alice, my mother, and so when we were in Carlsbad, Alice became the cultured part of our family. She started learning and playing classical piano. I remember well her playing Chopin nocturnes, and she started writing poetry, and she instilled in me a fierce attachment to using proper English language and being absolutely proper with regard to English grammar. Indeed, I'll confess, much later in life, in some moment of whimsy, someone said to me, we were in conversation, and someone said, well, it was me. And I went back to my desk and I jotted down, I wrote a little poem called In Praise of the Predicate Nominative.
Do you trot that out at family dinners? Didn't your mother write a book of poetry as well?
Oh, we're fast forwarding. We'll come back to the past, but in my mother's later years, she had a stroke a couple of years before she died, and then she recovered from the stroke. But we were deciding how to spend the time that we had remaining, and so we said, I said, why don't we rummage and collect all the poetry you've written across your lifespan and see if we can do something with that. So this was a fun project for us, and we did it. And we said, let's make a little book of your poetry. I, at the time, this is from my English legal history experience, I had become a collector of 18th century books and had been quite interested in the leather binding process and was taking bookbinding lessons, which was an interesting thing to do, quickly abandoned because it was too hard and too much time. But I had a classmate in the bookbinding class who was had a little business of bookbinding. So we put all this together and we printed, and I still have a number of these, about 100 copies of the book of my mother's poetry, which then she sent around to all of her lifelong friends. And so in her latter years, she was getting fan mail from all of the recipients of these. I do remember she wrote a poem for the opening preface of her book about her travels and children and growing up. And I remember in one verse, she was talking about travels in Europe, and she said the line where she got stuck was stringed plinking sounds from Viennese, and she needed the next line. And I supplied the next line, which was 3 sons abusing Furelise.
That's great. That's great. Okay,
Where were we?
We were with your brother. What was it like growing up as an identical twin?
Oh gosh, it was, well, I was first born. by 13 minutes, so I was in charge. And actually, many of you know John from his programs on this academy several years ago, but he went through, once he became a doctor, he decided to become a psychiatrist, and then he decided to become a classical psychoanalyst through the full Freudian period of training. And he later said that he thought that inspiration to become a psychoanalyst was because he had to work out getting past all the times I beat up on him growing up. I think he was only half serious. But being a twin, I mean, if you're identical twins especially, we did balk at one thing. Our mother wanted to dress us alike, and we said, no, we're not going to do that. But we were naturally an item in the elementary school, and growing up with people would be easy to meet new people and become friends. So it was basically a happy time. We didn't have exactly the same interests. But I did, in later life, realize that there's a small negative to being twins, and that is you don't have any incentive to develop a habit of making your own friends individually. And so when we went our separate ways, I thought about that and tried to make some adjustment in my habits.
With great success, I might add. So you went to high school in?
Yes, goodness. Well, we went from Carlsbad. Then in 1950, we moved to Dallas, Texas. My father was in a Southern Union gas company, which was a pipeline company. And as he advanced in the company, Dallas was its headquarters. So we moved there and lived there for 5 years. And then my father, for reasons far too complicated to mention, changed companies and went with a different company that was headquartered in the panhandle of Texas. So we moved in 1955 to Lubbock, Texas. Now, this is not a garden spot. And John and I were, oh goodness, we were probably a bit crude about this, but we did not want to go there. We thought we were going to be moving in with a bunch of West Texas hicks, if I may use that crude expression. But so it happened. And it turned out to be fine, and we ended up being happy with our high school, which was Lubbock High School. And there was one well-known graduate of that high school named Buddy Holly, who was just a year or two ahead of us. And there was another classmate of ours who became a less well-known Western singer named Mac Davis. I see some nodding heads. You do remember him. Well, I have to share another set of lyrics with you because Mac Davis had a favorite. His first really hit song was "Happiness is Seeing Lubbock, Texas in My Rearview Mirror." And here are some lyrics from that song. He said, "I was just 16 and out of control, lost to James Dean and rock and roll. I knew that down deep and in my country soul that I had to get away." And then comes the refrain. "And I thought happiness is seeing Lubbock, Texas in my rearview mirror. So I lit out one night in June, stoned on the glow of a Texas moon, humming an old Buddy Holly tune called Peggy Sue." And he goes on from there. Now, the reason I'm going through these lyrics is this. Brother John and I only went to one high school reunion. It was our 50th high school reunion. And naturally, we were shocked at how everyone looked. But there were various tables set up, and one table was set up by a classmate of ours whom we had never known when in high school. But at any rate, she was selling a copy of a book. And the title of the book was "Whatever Happened to Peggy Sue?" And she was Peggy Sue. She had been a girlfriend of one of the members of Buddy Holly's band.
That's a terrific story. So towards the end of high school, I understand that you and John were very intelligent and very accomplished. Yet when it came time to apply to colleges, both you and John were rejected from every college you applied to. How did that happen?
That, Madam Interviewer, is an exaggeration. We only applied to one college, and that was Rice Institute, which was a very good, and still is, a very fine school. Our older brother had gone to Rice Institute. Moreover, in the summer before we were applying for college, some organization decided to pick out across the state of Texas 25 promising high school students in the field of mathematics. And these 25 students would then spend the summer studying mathematics at Rice Institute. And John and I were 2 of those 25. At this remove, the only single thing I could remember from that summer is the Mobius strip. You know the Mobius strip. I don't think we contributed much to that session, but we figured it's an older brother who was a graduate, and we'd spent this summer there, that it was where we would go. So when we got rejected, it was a shock. But my father was not one to sit still with something negative like that. So here's what he did. He placed a call to the president of Rice University and did reach him by the phone, and he explained our situation and said he could not understand why we weren't admitted. And the president of Rice seemed fairly sympathetic. And after they conversed for a while, the president of Rice says, you know, I have a good friend who's the president of Duke University. How about if I give him a call on behalf of your boys? And that's what he did, and we immediately were admitted to Duke. And that's how we ended up on the East Coast.
Yeah. Not too shabby. So let's move through towards the end of college then. You were thinking about a future career. Your grandfather had been a doctor. Your older brother became a doctor. Your twin brother became a doctor. And you decided to go to law school. So how did you go wrong?
Well, there's nothing very interesting about this. My twin brother hadn't yet chosen medicine, but it was one thing that was clear to both of us was we had majored in civil engineering because it's what our father had done, and why not? He'd become a businessman. But John and I were quite clear that we didn't want to practice civil engineering by the second year of that program. So we didn't know which way to go, and John was attracted to medicine, and he did realize that's what he had to do, so he had to pick up the courses he didn't take before he recognized that's what he wanted. And my older brother had become a doctor and became a very well-known thoracic surgeon at Duke University Hospital, where he spent a very long career. I didn't have any craving to go to law school, but I just wanted to do something in the graduate school zone. So I took both the business school and the law school tests and applied various places and basically was prepared to flip a coin. But then I got accepted at Stanford Law School, and I had never been to California, so I said, is that okay, to my parents? And they said, well, the tuition there is $7,000, but I think we can do it. And so that's how I got into law.
And so you graduated from Stanford in '65, and we know that you eventually landed at Georgetown Law School in 1970. So just give us a quick view of those intervening years.
Sure. I had summer clerked in law school in Chicago with the firm Ross, Hardees, O'Keefe, Babcock, and McDougall. I'm amazed I just came up with all of those names right this minute. It was a good summer, and I was on the verge of going to practice there after law school, but I had gotten married in the last of my third year, and my ex-wife and I decided that we didn't want to really live in Chicago, and we thought Denver, Colorado was a very attractive community, so we just decided to move there. And that's where I got my first law practice job, and practiced law there for almost 5 years. Again, I didn't have a clear mission about what I wanted to specialize in, but the firm needed help in the field of labor law, and I had taken labor law in law school and liked it. So that was my introduction to the field that I've been involved in ever since. I had an irascible, very difficult partner that I worked with, and some had not been able to stand it, but we got along all right. And he taught me one thing that I've benefited from ever since. He said at the time, the most efficient way to do your writing and using a secretary is to learn to dictate your memos and briefs in almost perfect final form. And I rolled my eyes. I said, oh, that's not possible. But it was possible. And I once filed a Ninth Circuit amicus brief without changing a word. I lost. But I have benefited by that habit, and I still do it today. I'll dictate my arbitration opinions pretty close to final form. Where was I?
Well, I was hoping you would tell us about the law review article that you wrote.
Oh, goodness, yes. Later, when I'll tell the story in a moment of how I shifted from practice into legal academia, but I must have had some instincts that way, which I hadn't quite realized. And when I was practicing law in Denver, I took one of my seminar papers from Stanford and polished it and expanded it, and I published it in the Colorado Law Review. It was on a tax issue that I don't understand anymore. But right before that, my first law review article was in the Denver Law Journal in 1967. And here's how that happened. While I was working in the firm, it was 1966, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had just taken effect, and all over the nation, lawyers were advising their clients about what this meant for their work and their activities and their organizations. And in Colorado, we had mining clients who were coming to us incredulously and saying, what? We have to have women underground in the mines? Ooh, we have to carve out 2 restrooms for, and so on. As you can tell, it was quite alarming to a lot of our clients because of the sex discrimination ban that had been introduced. So I was set to work as a research project to just look around the nation and see what state laws existed that were in favor of the weaker sex or were protecting the weaker sex as things were thought to be at the time. And I thought it was a very interesting subject, and I did a big memo, and then I decided I would expand upon that memo and write a law review article. So I did, and this was my first article called Sex Discrimination and State Protective Laws. And I could talk a while about that, but I'll just give you one example. There were several states that had the following law: women were not permitted to be bartenders. And that was because these were indecorous places. Simply would be wrong to have women standing behind the bar. Well, in my law review article, talking about these laws, I then made the following sentence. I said, in states that do not have this prohibition against women being bartenders, no problems have been known to develop, period. Now, what empirical basis did I have? Well, I'll tell you. There was a bar across the street from the law firm called the Gaiety, and we frequently went there after work, and there was a lady bartender there that everybody liked, and I'd never seen any problems. And one would think that would be the end of the story, but here's the kicker. Many years later, in two state courts, in deciding to discard some state protective laws, the Supreme Court of California and the Supreme Court of New Jersey, and when they were writing about their laws that they were discarded, they referenced my article, and they cited that sentence. So I tell that to my law students now and say, you see how we can shape the law. We academics. Where were we?
Well, you had mentioned to me, and if you can quickly tell us the story. I understand you were supposed to be. You got a draft notice sometime.
Oh yes, yeah. This was Vietnam. So in 1967, I got my draft notice, and had to take the physical. And I guess this was '66. Yes. And I remember that physical. We went to the city and county building, and it was a huge long hallway, and all young men lined up the full stretch of this hallway. And pardon the crudity, but we got the following command, barked out over a loudspeaker. Turn and face the wall, drop your drawers, bend over and spread your cheeks.
For a second, I thought you were going to demonstrate.
Oh, I have some reserve. Well, so what to do? My father was vehemently against my going into the military, and I preferred not to. And I remembered that I had taken the MBA exam, and having passed that exam when that was still alive, the University of Denver had an MBA program that was located in downtown Denver. So I thought if I could apply there, that probably would get me a deferment. The draft board that was covering me then was in Amarillo, Texas, where my parents had moved. So I went and was immediately accepted into that program. So I became a full-time MBA student while I was a full-time lawyer at the same time. And I did get the deferment from the Amarillo, Texas. The next year, I could have gotten a different kind of a deferment because my ex-wife became pregnant with the person who is now son, Nelson Oldham. And that would have done it too, but my parents had instilled in me a bedrock principle, and that is you finish what you start. So I finished the MBA, and my wife, Dibby, sitting before me, who, as many of you know, is the most lovely person, and her career has been as a banker, and until fairly recently, she did not know that I had an MBA. And she found it unbelievable that I had an MBA. Moreover, it was an MBA in finance. Well, it looks good on the resume.
That's right. So let's wind back to around 1969. You decided for a career change, and tell us how you landed at Georgetown.
Yes. The partnership, the number of years to make partner in those days was much less than it is now. It was 5 years at the firm where I worked for, and I was approaching my 5th year and expected to be able to become a partner there, but then I started looking down the long road ahead, and I thought, I hadn't really much liked clients. And so I thought, do I want to get into partnership and keep on keeping on? And I said, I don't think so. So I then had to decide what to do. I didn't know which direction to go. And looking back, it surprises me. I inquired, made inquiries and interviews in a remarkable array of possibilities. For example, I flew to Chicago to interview United Airlines about being on their legal staff. That went nowhere. But I sought advice from one of my good friends at the time had left his law firm and gone to become an academic at Kansas Law School. So he said, well, come follow my footsteps and think about that. But I did other things too, and this was a time when you could write to important people and organizations and you wouldn't get the letter sent to a clerk to respond. The people would respond quite directly. And here were two examples. In my Stanford Law School class, there were only 3 women. One of the 3 was the daughter of John Gardner, who was the head of the Urban League at the time. Her name was Francesca Cheka Gardner. So I'm sure she said to me, why don't you write to my father? So I did, and got a very nice letter back from John Gardner saying, yes, there might be some possibilities, and let's explore these. I also wrote to Joe Blatchford, who was the head of the Peace Corps at the time, and I got a nice letter back from him. And quick aside, I was actually accepted to the Peace Corps and was going to be assigned to Tanganyika, but my father was ill by this time, and it just wasn't right to be overseas at that time, so I didn't pursue that. I often think, as I know many of you will have had these crossroads where you think, if that other matter had happened, what a different life I might have had, and that this was a good example of that. But then I wrote, I had gotten to know the dean of Stanford Law School when I was there, who had transferred from Yale to become the dean while I was there. Bayless Manning was his name. He was a corporate law person. And so I wrote to him and said, I would like to think about possibly entering legal academia, maybe probably for a full-time teaching position or perhaps an administrative position. Could he give me any advice? So he wrote back and said, as a matter of fact, one of their assistant deans was leaving, and perhaps I would be interested in that job. He explained that it's not going to be a tenure-track job. I believe in making a bright line between the administrators and the faculty for tenure-track. But still, you might be interested. Well, that turned my head a bit. I mean, here I was, a 29-year-old lawyer in Denver, Colorado, being interviewed to be an assistant dean at Stanford Law School. Well, I should pursue that, I thought, and I did, and I was offered the job. And then I kept thinking about whether I might want to be on the tenure track somewhere. And so the AALS hiring conference happened to be in San Francisco during this moment. I went through that process and got several interesting possibilities. And one of them was Georgetown Law School, which was looking for a combined administrator faculty member. The person would hold the position of assistant dean and associate professor of law. And because I had this offer from Stanford, I'm sure that was influential. At any rate, I was offered that position with Georgetown. And so I now had these 2 offers, and I decided to go with Georgetown. So I telephoned Dean Manning to decline the assistant dean offer there, and he paused for a moment and said, well, Jim, I understand completely your decision to go to the tenure track side of law schools, but I have one piece of advice for you. And I said, oh, what's that? He said, don't go to Georgetown. I was taken aback, but I said, why? And he said, Georgetown is in a mess right now, and I just wouldn't advise it. he was right. Georgetown had been this producer of very successful practicing lawyers. It was a large law school by this time, but it had never had any pretense of being a serious scholar, a producer of serious scholarship. But it seemed to me from my interviews with him that there were a handful of young Turks there who had a mission, and that was to change this law school into a serious, scholarly, naturally keeping the teaching side equally proficient. So I took a chance and took that, and it was another happy decision because I've been there now for 48 years.
Just let's backtrack just for one moment. Among the entities that you sought employment from Denver, even though you were encouraged,
I forgot that, yes.
there was one sad rejection.
This was interesting, yes. I had also written to the director, the placement director at Stanford, a woman who signed her name, paren, Miss, M-I-S-S, close paren, Suzanne Close. So Miss Close was very helpful to me, and she wrote a letter back at one point and said, you know, we've had an inquiry from Planned Parenthood in New York because they appear to be interested in hiring a general counsel. Perhaps you would write to them. So I did so, and there was a person who was, his job description was Associate to John D. Rockefeller III, and he was in charge of this search. He had been actually the person to persuade the organization that they needed a general counsel. And so I wrote to him, and we exchanged letters, and looking back, this just amazes me that I pursued this, but it might have been an interesting thing. But I did get a letter back, and that's what Bobby was referring to, and I thought I would read you one sentence out of the letter because it was interesting and a little surprising. He explained that their decision-making process at Planned Parenthood, and then he said the following, quote, I'm quoting, they, from Planned Parenthood, they thought a black lawyer might especially be knowledgeable about some of their present problems, and they have gone ahead and recruited a person with that qualification. So that's why I didn't go to Planned Parenthood, although later it turned out that recruit didn't apparently work out, and they wrote to me again to see if I was still interested, but I'd already hooked up with Georgetown by then.
Okay, let's get into your Georgetown life, which has been long and productive. You taught labor law, I take it?
I did. When I went, you remember, I had this dual responsibility, administrative and teaching, so I only had to teach one course while that, at least right at first. Bobby, I know you asked me, I don't know if it's in your script at the moment, but you said, how can you just go into law teaching without having been taught about teaching? And I said, that's just the way it was, and frankly still is, that if you've got a law practice and want to teach and have the qualifications, you get the job and talk with the school, and they say, what do you want to teach? And pick a course, or you're assigned a course, and then they say, good luck. And you have to find a case book to use, you have to think about what you're going to do, and naturally what you do is you think back to law school and said, who did I particularly admire among my teachers, and how did he work his teaching methods? So that's what I did, but fortuitously, I had practiced labor law. The man who had been teaching labor law at Georgetown was a Jesuit named Dexter Hanley, and in between the time I accepted the job and arrived, he had left Georgetown to become president of Scranton University. So they needed a labor law teacher, so that fell to me, and that's how I began my teaching career, which I quite enjoyed. And then I added a second course a couple of years later that was contracts the first year, which I still teach, first year entry-level course. And then time went by, and in my fourth year, I was approaching this this question of, I want to keep being an assistant dean, and that it was a good thing to do. I think that I had performed that quite successfully, but it was enough. So I quit being assistant dean and then just concentrated on my teaching and academic career and did get tenure and carried on from there.
We all know that you are not only a well-established labor law professor and an arbitrator, but you also have another passion in life, which was the common law of 18th century English law. How did that come about, and tell us about your sabbatical in writing?
Sure. This was another threshold intersection that came somewhat surprisingly. When I reached the stage where I was eligible for a first sabbatical, I thought I guess I had been a latent Anglophile, and I thought I would like to fashion a research project that would let me live in London for a year. So in teaching contracts, there was an English judge, a famous English judge from the late 18th century, the first Earl of Mansfield, who got to be known as the founder of English commercial law. He also had decided a very seminal anti-slavery case that was on the road to abolition, and did a lot of work in the developmental years in international law in connection with maritime shipping in particular. So he seemed a good subject to study. I'll take an extra 30 seconds to say one of the reasons he was an attractive subject was that it was thought that there wasn't much archival material that one could find, because in 1780, when this judge was in his 80s, or approaching his 80s, there were fierce riots across London called the Gordon Riots. And in fact, this is a subject, if you don't know, of one of the lesser Charles Dickens novels called Barnaby Rudge. It's all about the Gordon Riots, and there's a passage there that talks about Lord Mansfield, because the mob, this was an anti-Catholic riot. The Lord George Gordon was the head of it, and he was the head of the Protestant Association. And these riots swept across London, and they had some targeted places. Mansfield had written a number of opinions that was very tolerant of, very strongly in favor of religious toleration. He was a Church of England person, of course, but anyway, he had been picked out by the mob as a target, and they went to his house in Bloomsbury Square. Mansfield and his wife scuttled out the back door in the nick of time, and then the mob ravaged his house and went up to his library and took all of the manuscripts and books in that room, threw them out the window into the street, and made a bonfire of them. So all of that was gone. So that, I think, was why there hadn't been a lot of biographical writing about him. But here was the next lucky break. As I was going to England, it had been discovered in a little article announcing this to the world from a master in chancery, a man named Edmund Heward, was published in the Law Quarterly Review saying, well, about 50 leather-bound notebooks had been discovered in the attic of the family home, Scone Palace in Perth, Scotland, and these, it turned out to contain the handwritten notes that Lord Mansfield had kept while he was conducting jury trials across a span of about 30 years. And no one knew. So obviously my mission changed. When I went to England, I said, I've got to see if I can get a hold of those notes. And what was I going to do? Well, I put this down to the American spirit. I put on a suit. I walked down to the law courts. I asked the guard, I said, could you direct me, please, to Master Heward's chambers? And that was done, and I knocked on the door, and Master Heward answered the door. He was right out of Central Casting, tall, shock of white hair, slightly rotund, pinstriped suit on with a vest. And he looked at me with puzzlement, and I explained that I was going to do some work on Lord Mansfield. Well, you see, he and I had not been introduced. And so he was not welcoming for that reason. But he also had been writing, he had been looking at these trial notes, and he had been writing a slim biography of Mansfield, which he had in typescript at the time. And so that overcame his lack of an introduction, because he invited me in to speak with him about it. And I then asked him if I could come on additional days to read his typescript in his chambers, and that happened. And then I asked his advice. Now, how could I possibly see these notebooks myself? He said, write to the Earl, the 7th Earl of Mansfield, who was the custodian of these notebooks. So I did, and days passed, and I heard nothing. And then on another visit to Edmund Heward, he said, have you gotten the notebooks? And I said, no, I wrote the letter and I never heard back. And he thought for a moment, and then he said, look here, I know you now. What about if I drop the Earl a note? Which he did, and days later I got the letter from the 7th Earl authorizing me to see these trial notes. So I spent a bitter winter in Edinburgh at the West Register House looking at these notebooks. Now, these notebooks are filled almost entirely with handwritten notes. It's just what we do as arbitrators, the handwritten notes of witness testimony with possibly a scribbled personal editorial note in the margin here and there. And so I had no training as a historian, and I'm sitting in this frigid room going through these notes, and I began to despair. I thought, what am I doing here? But then I came upon a case named Moses against McFarlane, and I thought, gosh, I know this case. It was a case I had read in my contracts course in law school. And here was the original cloth that was written down. And the very first thing that was noticeable about it was the name of the plaintiff in the printed reports of the case was, I can't remember his first name, let's say William Moses. But in the trial notes, the word William was crossed out, and the word Sarah was written above it. So I learned that the plaintiff was a woman, which had never been known. Because she was a married woman, she could not appear as a plaintiff. Her husband had to appear. So that already was interesting. So that was my epiphany, and I stayed with it. And let's say approximately 12 years later, I published my magnum opus, a 2-volume set with the catchy title, The Mansfield Manuscripts and the Growth of English Law in the 18th Century. And those 2 volumes ran about 1,700 pages in print.
And you had the opportunity to have a conversation about those 2 volumes with an esteemed person.
Oh yes, okay. This is one of Dibby's favorite stories. One way fast forward until, let's say, 1993, and there was a reception at the U.S. Supreme Court, and we were circulating. It was shortly after Justice Souter had become a member of the Supreme Court, and he had been taking a bit of flack in the press because he was very slow in issuing his opinions. He was just seemingly way too deliberative. But at any rate, at this reception, a friend of mine in a small gathering introduced me to Justice Souter and mentioned that I had just published this 2-volume work, and perhaps in being kind, Justice Souter said, "Oh yes, I know of that work." And then he paused, and then he said, "How long did it take you to do that?" And I thought, oh, I better be truthful here. So I said, "Actually, about 12 years. And without blinking, he said, "Gee, I wish I could dash things off like that."
So we're going to change gears and move into your arbitration career. But I'm sitting here thinking, you got into college without applying. You got to Georgetown Law School without ever teaching. You wrote a 2-volume treatise without any training as a historian.
And I got an MBA without understanding it.
Okay, that too. I'm just wondering if we should review your NAA application.
Well, in truth, I didn't have the requisite number of cases. But in those days, I suppose it may still be true, some exceptions are made with people who are full-time academics because obviously you can't have the same volume of cases that you would if you were full-time. And I had, when I taught labor law, I had done management side work in law practice, but when I became an academic and I was a teacher of labor law, I was sanitized, I think. So I could legitimately call myself a neutral then, if in my spirit, I think I was more on the employee side than the management side. But I would interact with labor law teachers and sometimes with practitioners in the field, and at some point, someone suggested, "Why don't you think about doing some arbitration?" And I thought it was an interesting idea. And in those days, as an academic, here's what I had to do to be put on the AAA list and the FMCS list. I had to write a letter to each of them. That was it. I was on the lists. That wouldn't happen today, I don't think. So in time, some parties decided to give me a try, and cases began to trickle in. At some point along that road, I met some members of the Academy, including Rolf Walton, and oh, I owe so much to Rolf. He became my mentor. He encouraged me in my very early days in practice, and he was the impartial umpire for Bethlehem Steel and the steel workers then. Ralph Seward was still in view. He was the impartial chairman of this panel of 5 arbitrators. And I'll skip forward a bit, but a time came when he needed a replacement on that panel, so Rolf asked if I would join the panel for Bethlehem Steel, which I did, and continued in that capacity. I do have one opinion, only one. Well, here's how it works. You know this. If you're a junior on a panel like this, you are the author of the opinion, and you sign it, but it has to have a separate signature approved by the chairman or the umpire. So I had one and only one opinion that was signed off on by Ralph Seward. It was an incentives case, and I didn't understand it then, and I don't understand it now, and I'm glad it was the only one I ever had. But I treasure that Ralph Seward moment. Well, when Rolf ceased being the impartial umpire for Bethlehem, I succeeded him in that status, and I carried that role over until Bethlehem died in 2003.
Let's talk about your experience as a sports arbitrator. Everyone likes to hear that.
Well, this is again, it was not something I really sought out, but everybody, I think, finds it intriguing to participate in this zone of arbitration if the opportunity arises. We had a good friend, he is still a great friend, but he was a partner in Proskauer Rose in Washington at the time. And Proskauer in New York does lots of sports arbitration. And he said one day, why don't I just send your name up as a possible someone to interview if they need anyone. So he did that, and I did get some responses in a while. I got an inquiry from the National Basketball Association, interviewed them with some other people. They didn't hire anybody after that, so that just died. But then I got an inquiry from the National Hockey League and interviewed them and was hired as the grievance arbitrator. And this was 2007 by now. Happened to be the year of the lockout. So that was an unusual time to start that, but there were some issues that arose out of the lockout that came to arbitration. And I continued that for 3 years. And they had a lot of business then, and I was trying to be a full-time law teacher, a responsible one. And so finally, they wanted 5 hearing days a month, and the hearings would be either in New York or Toronto. So finally, I just sent them a notice that I had to stop. I couldn't keep doing this. And the next thing, I got a letter from the league firing me. And I emailed them back and said, you can't fire me, I've already quit. And now, as most of you know, I've had the honor of being fired twice by the National Hockey League because they came back to me when they created the position of the neutral discipline arbitrator, now held by one Shyam Das. And I only had one case, and it was a notorious case. If you're a hockey fan, you will know about it. It was in 2016, the Dennis Weidman case, in which he was, according to the commissioner, cross-checked a referee. And there was a video of this in which the referee was just flat on his face on the ice, and that went viral on YouTube with the headline, "Gotta see it." So Weidman was suspended for 20 games for this, and the Players Association appealed it to me, and we had 2 days of hearing in New York. I went frame by frame through that video, and I'll just quickly come to the end. The referee's guidelines, which the commissioner had been following, said a 20-game suspension was appropriate if a player on the ice injures a referee or collides with a referee with the intent to injure him. A 10-game suspension says you're the penalty if a player collides with a referee but without an intent to injure him. And that was the crux of this case. The commissioner wrote a long opinion saying, yes, this was. Just look at the video. That's all you have to do. I disagreed, so I reduced the penalty to 10 games. I just could not decide that Weidman had been checked hard against the boards before this happened and was trying to get off the ice, and he was dazed, and I just could not fashion that he was intending to injure this referee. So you would think that would be the end of it, especially since the collective bargaining agreement says the neutral discipline arbitrator's decision shall be final and binding and not subject to review. But 2 things happened after that. The next thing, that's when I got my letter firing me and then the league filed a complaint in federal district court in New York to vacate my opinion. The Players Association filed a motion to dismiss. The league filed a motion for summary judgment, and it went before a very able judge now. named Allison Nathan, and she held 2 days of hearing in New York, and then sat on the case for about 3 months. And meanwhile, in the atmosphere in the background is the Brady case, which had recently been issued by the Second Circuit. And so Judge Nathan, after deliberating, issued a very detailed 15-page single-spaced opinion, upholding my opinion 100%. And she went through all of the standard benchmarks about arbitration that went back to the Steelworkers Trilogy and Gateway Coal and all of these things. And she said much more than she needed to say to take care of the fact that she agreed with my opinion. And I think what she was doing was telling the Second Circuit, don't appeal, don't take this case. If you do, just dispose of it, because she didn't want them to, she didn't want the Brady case and this one to get intermixed. That's just speculation.
Football.
Oh, football. Well, baseball too.
Okay.
No, I do with a number of you. We do Major League Baseball salary arbitration, and that's really interesting. It's a very intense. You all know the process, and it is wonderful to participate in. They require all arbitrators to be members of the academy. We sit in 3-member panels, and it's really a fun thing to do. Passing comment, many of you will know this if you're baseball fans, but the average salary for a Major League Baseball player in 2017 was $4 million. Average. So it goes up. Okay. Last sports bit. The National Football League, in the 2011 collective bargaining contract, the NFL and the Players Association entered into a really long-term contract, a 10-year contract. It runs till 2021. And there's a long history about how they had an arrangement to have disputed cases decided by a Minnesota federal judge, and that's too curious and too complicated but they decided it was time for a change. So they created this 3-member appellate panel, and they specified in the collective bargaining contract that at least one of the members had to be a former federal judge. Well, in the end, they hired 2 former federal judges, and I was the 3rd member. So, but it's very unusual, isn't it, to have within the collective bargaining contract a scheme for appealing an arbitration decision. The system arbitrator, which is the arbitrator that decides the cases that can be appealed to us, is Stephen Burbank, who's on the University of Pennsylvania law faculty, a very able fellow. And the first case we had was the Bounty Gate case, the New Orleans Saints case, where the players and the assistant coaches cooked up this scheme under the table to have special rewards for special crushing hits of opposing players on the field. So, for example, if a player on the Saints was able to hit an opposing player hard enough so that it would become what they call a cart-off, the player leaves on a cart, you had a specified sum that you earned there. And obviously this was not legit. So that was our first case, and we disagreed with the commissioners upholding that suspension that had been issued his penalty was too heavy. And I will say, with some sheepishness, that what one would normally do in a case like that is to remand the case back down to the arbitrator whose opinion you were differing from. But we didn't do that. We just vacated Goodell's decision to uphold it. And then he was going to do it over again, and there was a lot of uproar about having him sit to hear the case a second time. So he Paul Tagliabue to hear the case. But we've had only 2 other cases since then. We're told that one more lies in wait, but one of the judges has retired, and so they're looking for the 3rd member.
Well, we started late, so we have maybe 10 or 15 minutes left. I want to move away from your professional life to your personal life. And I know you have 2 grown children living in Colorado with their families, and 4 brilliant and adorable grandchildren. That's right?
Exactly right, all parts of it.
And I know I'm going to be right in the next thing I'm going to say. I know that you're approaching 25 years of marital bliss with Elizabeth Conahan, who's here today. Say hello to everyone, Dibby. We know and love her as Dibby. Dibby shared with me an interesting story about how you met, and what she told me is that you had a systematic approach to dating. And this was the early 1990s.
Okay.
Do I have to say anything more to remind you?
No. Well, I had been divorced for some years, and I had a very good friend, neighbor in the neighborhood where we lived in Forest Hills in Washington, named Willie Lewis, and she is a notorious matchmaker. And at one point she said to me, look, if you ever want to meet someone to date again, well, just give me a call. I can make some recommendations. So that moment came, and I called Willie and said, Willie, okay, I'm ready. I think I would like to start dating again. She said, okay, hold the phone, let me get my book. She comes back with the book, and she rattles off 5 names with their phone numbers, all of whom had authorized her to do this if the occasion arose. Oh, you knew that you had given her permission. That's right. That's right. So, okay, they have these 5 names, and I said, Willie, get your husband Finley. Get him on another extension. And so he got on the phone, and I said, Finley and Willie, how about ranking these for me? I'm going to push on here. So they did. And afterwards, I called and went out with all 5 of them in order. And Dibby she sometimes claims she was number 3, but she wasn't. She was number 2. And number 1 I went out with, we still see her in Washington from time to time, but there was no spark at all there. Very nice woman. But then I moved to number 2, and Willie had told me that Dibby was about to throw a party at her Georgetown house, and maybe if I called, she would invite me. So I did, and yes, she did invite me. So we had never seen each other before, and so I come to the door and explain who I am, and we greet each other, and she's the hostess now for this party that's underway. So I come in and merge with the crowd, and for a long time we had no occasion to talk, but finally as the crowd thinned, we had a few moments, and I said, you know, I happen to have some ballet tickets for next week. Would you like to go? And she paused and said, yes, and I was really glad you asked me, because the last time I did this, when I gave a party, the guy who was coming to meet me went off with somebody else. And she said, and tonight at this party, there are a lot of good-looking women here. And so that was the history. We started dating, and there was a big spark here. As all of you who know her, she is very easy to love. In fact, most of the time she said it, I didn't. But she later told me that it became clear to her early that we were going to get married. How quickly did you? She said
2
about
weeks,
2
she
weeks.
said.
And sure enough, it was a wonderful decision.
Well, it's almost time to wrap up. But as a final note, you provided me with an interview that was conducted of you in 2006, and that was for the Georgetown Law Weekly. And some of the questions that were asked of you were kind of goofy, but 3 of them were as timely today as they were then, and I just want to see if you would answer them the same way today. So regarding the Supreme Court, you were asked whether you still believe that it's better that Supreme Court justices have life tenure or term limits, and you answered that you still believed that they should have life tenure. So do you still agree to that?
Yes, with sadness. I do.
Okay. A second question, in 2006 this was should a fence be built between the United States and Mexico to control immigration? And your answer was definitely not. How do you feel about that today?
Well, let me think. Most definitely not.
And another timely question was in 2006 regarding midterm elections that were coming up that fall. You were asked if the Democrats would gain control of either the Senate or the House, and you said, "I fervently hope so." Do you still agree?
I don't have to think about that. Absolutely.
Well, and I'm going to open the floor to the audience. I just want to mention one thing that we didn't get to talk about was your athletic career, having run a number of marathons.
Well, if there are questions, we'll take them. If they're not, I'll tell one more story. But Okay, I used to run marathons and did the Marine Corps a number of times, and that's the backdrop for this. But Debbie and I, through a client and friend of hers, were given an invitation to go to a pre-inaugural ball in the when Obama was elected. It was called the Root Ball, which was from the Root Foundation that sponsors support for disadvantaged children. And it was a happening event with predominant African-American people in attendance, but a mixture. So we attended, and we were just sort of looking at the crowd and standing on the sidelines, and Oprah Winfrey came in. And much to Debbie's mortification, I just walked over to have a word with Oprah. And she hadn't been noticed yet, and her minder was just moved aside. And so I said, "Oprah, I wanted to tell you about a moment that we almost interacted that you were going to enjoy." I said, "It's the moment when you passed me during the Marine Corps Marathon." And she did like this, so she became animated. We were talking about this for a few minutes, and then people came in and, there's Oprah Winfrey, and she was swept away. And there was a bit more then, but I thought that was the end of this interesting little vignette. But the next morning, I had a friend call me, and he said, "Have you seen the Washington Post?" I said, "No." He said, "Go get it." And turn to the style section and open it up to the reliable source. You'll remember that column that was there for many years. I did, and it was a story about the Root Ball, and there was one picture in it, a fairly large picture, and here was the caption beneath it: "Oprah hobnobbing with VIP at the Root Ball."
And it was you. Well, with that, I thank you all and thank Jim. Hug.
Well done.
Very well done.
We got to get.